Irish passion regarding Palestine. The plight of Palestine through Irish eyes. Throughout the past 7 decades, there hasn't been many countries, among the non-Muslim countries, whether in terms of politicians or the people on the street, that have been open supporters of Palestine and openly critical of Israel, than that of Ireland and the Irish. Once you look at the history of this nation and its people, it becomes clear as to why this is the case. So what I'd like to do is give you all a shortish history on the struggles of the Irish, so that you can see the parallels between the Irish and the Palestinians. As an introduction, I'd like to provide some lyrics to a song from popular Irish rebel band the Wolfe Tones. For those who don't know, Irish rebel music refers to folk songs which are primarily about the various rebellions against the English and later British Crown rule. They often focus on the physical force of the Irish Republicans in the context of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Go on home, British soldiers, go on home. Have you got no fucking homes of your own? For 800 years we've fought you without fear, and we'll fight you for 800 more. If you stay, British soldiers, if you stay, you'll never ever beat the IRA, for the 14 men in Derry are the last that you will bury, so take a tip and leave us bloody be. So go on home, British soldiers, go on home. Have you got no fucking homes of your own? For 800 years we fought you without fear, and we will fight you for 800 more. We're not British, we're not Saxon, we're not English. We're Irish, and proud we are to be. So fuck your Union Jack, we want our country back. We want to see old Ireland free once more. So as the lyrics tell us, the issue between the Irish and the English or British has been an ongoing issue spanning 800 years, a tug of war between a colonial bully and a small downtrodden people who refuse to give up no matter what they face. So up until the 1100s there had always been minor incursions between the islands of Ireland and Britain in the centuries leading up to that, but it did get serious when the English started invading Ireland in the 1170s under King Henry II, with the reasons being cited as to do with church reformations. The divided kings were no match for Henry II and his forces, and soon after the bishops of Ireland soon accepted him as the overlord, and this put an end to the High Kingship of Ireland, with the last king, Rory O'Connor, having to abdicate in the 1180s. Things were relatively quiet over the next few hundred years, with the English monarchy ruling as lords of Ireland, but over the centuries much of the land England owned in Ireland had shrank markedly, with much of the land being run by native Gaelic chieftains once again. This is up until the 16th century, when the Tudor monarchy intensified efforts to bring Ireland back under English control. And this conquest led to the establishment of the Kingdom of Ireland under King Henry VIII in 1543. An important point to note here is that England had become a Protestant nation in the 16th century, whereas Ireland remained fiercely Catholic, which added another point of contention between the already tense differences between both nations. There was constant resistance from the Irish, with the strongest resistance being the northeast, the region of Ulster, and so in 1609 the British, at this point Scotland had joined with England and Wales, so I will now use the term British, they wanted to anglicise the region, essentially make it more English by confiscating land off the landowners and giving it to rich, loyal settlers, Protestants from Scotland and Northern England. This way, they could have more control of Ulster, and so this was called the Plantation of Ulster. Between 1641 and 1653, the Irish Rebellion resulted in conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, followed by the Cromwellian conquest, which led to more land confiscations and repression. In 1690, the Battle of the Boyne solidified Protestant dominance in Ireland with the defeat of James II, the last Catholic king of England and Ireland. From the 1720s to the 1770s, the penal laws were enforced rigorously, limiting Catholic rights, making life slowly but surely worse for them. In 1798, the United Irishmen's Rebellion sought independence from British rule, and in 1801, the Act of Union merged the Kingdom of Ireland with the Kingdom of Great Britain, forming the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And in the 1840s, the Great Famine arrived in Ireland. Regarding this and the plight of the Irish people, I want to read some pages from a book called A Short History of Ireland, 1500 to 2000, and this is going to be some excerpts from chapter 13. The population of Ireland went from 8.2 million in 1841 to 6.5 million in 1851. And a side note, my great-great-great-great-granddad John and his father Patrick lived through this famine. The drastic loss of population was a death toll of 1 million plus due to malnutrition, starvation and disease. Emigration accounts for the remainder. Central to the famine was the failure of a single crop, the potato, which was a fixture of Irish life, the staple diet for the poorest section of a rapidly expanding population. Another side note, potatoes really are easy and suited to being grown in northwestern Europe. My 9-year-old daughter herself planted some this summer in our garden and we got a decent yield from it. So when the Irish saw the success of the potato, it displaced dairy and pulses in the Irish diet. A recurring theme in the accounts written by visitors to Ireland in the pre-famine era is the appalling material deprivation of the vast underclass. The former slave Frederick Douglass, who visited Ireland in 1845, told his fellow abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, "I had heard much of the misery and wretchedness of the Irish people, previous to leaving the United States, and was prepared to witness much on my arrival in Ireland, but I must confess, my experience has convinced me that the half has not been told." Douglas was horrified by the squalor of Dublin streets and the wretched villages that skirted the city. He who had seen the slave's cabin wrote that, of all the places to witness human misery, ignorance, degradation, filth and wretchedness, an Irish hut is preeminent. In the 1841 census, it was recorded that 51% of dwellings were fourth class, officially described as mud cabins having only one room. What made things worse is that the labourers on the bottom of the social class were often not given a cash payment or wage for their labour, but were given a cabin to live in and a small subsistence plot to grow some crops for themselves. Within this system, the potato played a key role. With a high yield and its dietary qualities, it proved to be essential for the lower classes, as it was a remarkably complete foodstuff, being comprised of carbs, protein and vitamins B and C. So before the famine, the potato accounted for 1/3 of Irish agricultural output. The cause of the famine was a strange disease that attacked the potato throughout Western Europe in 1845, a fungus, and many countries suffered, but none of them were as reliant on the potato as the Irish. 2.4 million acres were devoted to growing potatoes before 1845, and this soon dropped to 284,000. But 1846 was even worse, and there was a total failure of the crop. Unrest manifested itself from an early stage. A particular source of anger was the continued export of cash crops, grown to sell for profit in the early years of the famine, which prompted food riots in coastal towns and cities. The size of the British garrison grew during this time, and more money was actually spent on security, £40 million during this time, than famine relief at £9.5 million. And so Ireland, despite being part of the United Kingdom, was left to deal with what was an Irish problem. A harrowing account of a visit to Belmullet, in Mayo, the county most ravaged by the famine, was left by the English Quaker William Bennett. The scenes of human misery and degradation we witnessed will haunt my imagination, with the vividness and power of some horrid and tyrannous delusion, rather than the features of a sober reality. Perhaps the poor children presented the most piteous and heart-rending spectacle. Many were too weak to stand, their little limbs thin and feeble, except when the frightful swellings had taken the place of previous emaciation. Beyond the power of volition when moved, every infantile expression entirely departed, and in some, reason and intelligence had evidently flown. Many were remnants of families, crowded together in one cabin, orphaned little relatives taken in by the equally destitute, and even strangers. They did but rarely complain. When inquired of what was the matter, the answer was alike in all. Indeed, the hunger. We truly learned the terrible meaning of that sad word. hunger. Malnutrition opened the door to diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and cholera. Between 1801 and 1920, as many as 8 million people emigrated from Ireland. Even before the famine, the Irish were the major source of overseas labour for both Britain and USA, and between 1845 and 1855, New York had 900,000 Irish immigrants, more Irish-born residents than what Dublin had. Today, it is estimated that over 30 million people living in the USA have Irish ancestry, and 6 million people living in the UK have at least one Irish grandparent. I myself have 2 Irish grandparents. Also, what's worth noticing is that through all of the chaos of the famine, so much wealth was lost, which led to loss of inheritance for the following generations. A people who had nothing were going to get nothing and had nothing to look forward to. And we can see in other works the effects that this had. So just to add some experiential imagery to the picture, what follows is an excerpt from the 1890s book Anglo-Saxon Superiority to What It Is Due, page 136 to 137. I mentioned the contrast presented, even at first glance, by 2 kinds of dwellings. The first, inhabited by Scotch workmen of the lowlands, and kept with extreme care. The other, occupied by Irish workmen, dirty and miserable looking. This contrast called my attention to the importance of the home as a starting point in the social evolution. During the late 19th century, there was still heavy discrimination of the Irish Catholics by the British rulers. On paper, this United Kingdom was meant to be complete parity between the peoples of Ireland and those of Britain, but in reality, it was a brutally unequal partnership between them. Centuries of increasing interference and exploitation. There was Irish representation in Westminster, but it was not enough to hide the ugly truth. They were a colony, at a time where Britain's economy was going really well. The Irish economy stagnated. The famine, essentially being mismanagement from London. They lived in the bleakest poverty. The Catholic South excluded from the richness of the empire. The Protestant landowners did okay, but for most it was awful. They were constantly stole from and insulted. And thus the political idea of nationalism and self-determination grew. This then led to land reform movements seeking to address issues of land ownership and tenants' rights, and the Home Rule movement emerged, advocating for Irish self-governance within the United Kingdom. On the lead-up to World War I, opinion was slowly growing towards separating from the British, and when the British were preoccupied with the war, in 1916, Irish Republicans launched the Easter Rising against British rule and proclaimed an Irish Republic. They were soon defeated after a week of fighting, but this ended up garnering greater popular support throughout Britain for Irish independence, which led to Republican Party Sinn Féin winning a landslide victory in Ireland in 1918 with over 90% of the votes. They formed a breakaway government in 1919 and declared Irish independence, which led to the 2 years Irish War of Independence. On the lead up to this, there were waves of executions, raids, and thousands of Irish were arrested. A unit of the relatively newly formed Irish Republican Army, the IRA, acting by themselves, attacked some British soldiers, wounding 12 and killing 1. They also set up an assassination unit to take out any Irish who may have been colluding with the British. When the British retaliated, they attempted to burn the city of Cork to the ground, and civilians were viewed as the enemy as well. All in all, after 2 years, this led to 491 deaths on the Irish side, 936 on the British side, and 900 civilian deaths. There was no major military victory, due to issues of supplies and politics. Whilst not given the all-clear to be completely free, Ireland was allowed to become a dominion of Britain and be an Irish Free State, and the ceasefire kicked in 1921. What followed from this was voting, and at the polls in 1922 most of Ireland voted to separate from the United Kingdom and become the Irish Free State, all but a small segment of the island, where most loyalist Protestants lived, electing to remain within the United Kingdom. And this area after this point is called Northern Ireland. Not everyone in Ireland agreed to this partition of Ireland into two distinct countries, and it led to a civil war between the IRA and the National Irish Army, which was backed by the British. Despite the IRA losing the war, they didn't disband after the Civil War. The anti-colonial struggle didn't end. They still wanted to see the unification of the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland into a new, unified Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, discrimination was rampant. Most large businesses were run by Protestant Unionists, and they gave preference to fellow Protestants, and some wouldn't even hire Catholics. Police and courts were overwhelmingly Protestant, and at this time housing was more than just a place to live. One could only vote if they owned property, and Protestants were more likely to own this property. Even council homes were much more likely to be given to Protestant families by the Protestant local councillors, who would then vote to keep them in power, a vicious cycle. Despite all this, the majority of Republicans wanted peaceful reform, but in 1971, the British brought in internment, meaning they could lock up IRA affiliates, or anyone they deemed to be, without trial. This led to a large protest in Londonderry in 1972. A big march against internments was planned, even though large gatherings had been banned by the British government. During the protest in front of the public and the press, British soldiers fired live rounds into the protesters, killing 14 people, and this day is known as Bloody Sunday. This was the end of any peace. Support for armed revolution surged. IRA was back with a vengeance for the next 30 years, with thousands signing up for recruitment. The IRA turned out to be a very feared paramilitary group. So much so that 21,000 British troops were brought into Northern Ireland and remained for 38 years, which was the longest military deployment in British history. The IRA were planting bombs, specifically targeting the British forces, as well as having a bombing campaign against infrastructural, commercial and political targets, as well as kidnappings, and there was apparently some funding from the Irish diaspora in the USA. The Loyalists, that's the UVF and the UDF, attacked Republicans and the wider Catholic community in what they referred to as the retaliation. There was sectarian tit-for-tat violence, and the British security forces undertook policing and counter-insurgency, primarily against Republicans. Throughout this period, 1968 to 1998, there was numerous riots, mass protests and acts of civil disobedience, leading to segregation and the creation of temporary no-go areas. There was over 3,700 killed in this conflict, 50,000 injured, with over 10,000 bombings. It was true guerrilla war, on the streets, in the countryside. The IRA were branded terrorists by Britain, especially when bombings were done on British land, in cities like London and Manchester, a bombing I myself actually remember. But obviously, the IRA didn't recognise themselves as terrorists, and they felt absolutely justified. All in all, 54% of all those who were killed were civilians. 1/3 of the IRA's killings were of civilians, whereas a whopping 85% of people the UVF and UDF killed were civilians. So from the IRA's perspective, there was a lot of hypocrisy. In the mid-80s, the IRA fractured into two groups, and by 1994, one of these groups wanted peace and a resolution, whereas the other wanted to carry on fighting. But overall, tensions were easing, and finally there was the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, where Unionists and Republicans managed to sit down and come to an agreement. There was a vote, and most people wanted to remain in the UK. After 2 referendums, peace was reached. There was no more killings or car bombs, etc. The paramilitaries gave up a lot of their arms. The issue is still not fully resolved today, but there's been a long peace in place for now. The IRA is still technically armed. There are still very, very minor small conflicts now and then, but it's nothing major. During the years of this conflict, which was called the Troubles in British newspaper and media and such, the opinions worldwide on the IRA were diverse, much like they are now with Hamas, and foreign countries had varied perspectives on the conflict depending on their geopolitical alliances, historical relationships, and individual countries' principles. 2 countries who did view IRA in a negative light is obviously one, the UK, who placed them as an organisation under the Terrorism Act 2000, and the second was Republic of Ireland, who viewed them as an unlawful organisation. The USA is an interesting one because the Americans were differing among themselves, using contradictory terms to describe IRA, such as activists, guerrilla militias, and sometimes terrorists. This could be due to the fact that America had such a large number of Irish in their country, they didn't want to anger any group and tried to remain neutral. There was much more support for the struggles of the IRA throughout the world. Many countries, governments, not officially supporting them, but here's a few who made their views clear. 1. Libya, under Gaddafi, who was known to provide some financial and diplomatic support to the IRA during the 70s and 80s. He viewed the IRA as an anti-imperialist force against British influence. 2. Iran, especially during the Islamic Revolution and the subsequent period. They expressed sympathy for anti-imperialist movements globally, and there was definitely instances of rhetorical support for the Irish Republican cause. 3. Lebanon, which experienced its own conflicts during this period, had factions sympathetic to various anti-colonial movements, and some of the Lebanese groups expressed support for the IRA, emphasising shared struggles against perceived occupation. And the main one to mention would be the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, expressed solidarity with the IRA, drawing parallels between their struggles for self-determination. The Irish Republican cause was sometimes seen as resonating with the broader anti-colonial sentiments in the Middle East. Moving on to Ireland's support for Palestine, so now that we've seen some of Ireland's history, we can look at some of the shared similarities between Ireland and Palestine, such as having a history of foreign invasion, land disputes, human rights concerns such as displacement, refugees and the treatment of civilians during periods of violence, complex peace processes, guerrilla warfare and resistance, foreign support and solidarity, partition and division, and religious and ethnic tensions. Initially, Ireland and the Irish were somewhat pro-Zionist, believing that as a people that were targeted in the early 20th century, they felt that the Jews needed their own land, but that soon changed. So obviously Irish political opinion saw the evolution of its attitude towards Zionism much through the prism of the British. If the Zionists and the British are on the same side of partition, then we can't support the Zionists, said Rory Miller, Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. And at the League of Nations, Irish Prime Minister Eamon de Valera denounced the carve-up of Palestine into different states as cruel and unjust, a bitter repetition of Ireland's own division by the British 15 years earlier. There was still some considerable support for Israel in Ireland by the time of the 1967 war, but growing awareness of the fate of the Palestinian refugees, alongside the work of the Irish charities and civil rights groups in Palestine, began to shift public opinion. Organised, mobilised activism on behalf of the Palestinians is absolutely, relative in per capita terms, higher in Ireland than it is in Britain or Germany or many EU countries, said Miller. Israel's conduct during the Lebanese civil war, where 30,000 Irish soldiers served as peacekeepers, soured attitudes even more. The deaths of a number of Irish soldiers at the hands of Israel and its proxy forces were among the reasons Dublin did not open an Israeli embassy until 1993. And Ireland was the first member of the European Committee to recognise the Palestinian Liberation Organisation as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people in 1980, with others following a few months later, and became a stalwart advocate for the two-state solution, hosting a meeting with Yasser Arafat on several occasions, sometimes to the ire of the Israeli government. And when Yasser Arafat visited Ireland, there was a great reception for him in Dublin. He was treated as a freedom fighter. Though Ireland has never broken with EU foreign policy and still officially supports the two-state solution set out in the Oslo Accords, leaders from across the Irish political spectrum have sharply criticised Israel's settlement policy, breaches of human rights and undermining of the peace process. It has also expressed concerns over the living conditions of civilians in Gaza who have been affected by decades of Israeli blockades. The Irish government has repeatedly called for unhindered access for humanitarian aid in Gaza, and it backed the 2012 United Nations General Assembly resolution granting non-member observer state status to Palestine. Former President Higgins said that Israel's threat of an aerial bombardment on Gaza was a clear breach of international law, stating that it was one thing to breach international law, but to actually announce in advance that you're going to break international law and that you announce it again and again and that you do so on an innocent population was something that reduces international law to tatters. Historically, various Dublin's governments have supported a two-state solution in the Middle East, with Israel and a future Palestine state living side by side in peace. The Irish government has been critical of illegal Israeli settlers in the West Bank and has publicly supported calls for the recognition of East Jerusalem as the capital of any future Palestinian state. Their criticism has only grown as the two-state solution appears increasingly doomed, and as the EU has become preoccupied with other foreign policy issues, and the result has been an often fractious diplomatic relationship with Israel. Ireland is unlikely to be an important player on the international stage, but Sinn Féin's John Boyne believes that the Irish government can use its influence within the EU and the United Nations, where it currently sits on the Security Council, to convince other states that annexation is a reality and that Israel must face consequences for violating the rights of Palestinians. It is now time for the EU, he said. It's time for other countries around the world to take that stand against the apartheid system that Israel perpetrates. We hope that we have set a course for other countries to follow suit. Boyne, the foreign affairs speaker for the opposition left-wing Sinn Féin party, who tabled a recent motion, said that the move was a direct consequence of Israel's actions and an expression of the common bonds between Irish and Palestinian sufferings. But his party wants to go further. Sinn Féin supports the boycott, divest and sanctions BDS movement, as well as expelling the Israeli ambassador, which the governing Conservative, Fianna Fáil and centre-right Fine Gael parties oppose. The time has gone for words of condemnation. Now is the time to take decisive action against a lawbreaker that presides over an apartheid system, he said. And briefly touching on Glaswegian football club Celtic, the Scottish club has a historical strong connection to the Irish identity. The club, being founded in 1887 by an Irishman, had the goal of alleviating poverty within the Irish immigrant community in Glasgow. And over the years, Celtic has maintained a significant Irish and Catholic support base. The displays of Irish flags and symbols, along with expressions of solidarity with various causes, especially Palestine, is rooted in this historical and cultural context. Palestinian flags and murals in support of the Palestinian people can be seen in Republican neighbourhoods in Northern Ireland. There are also a number of Irish-based support groups who regularly organise protests and marches in support of Palestinian support groups. Many of those taking part in protests can often be seen wearing the keffiyeh, a traditional headdress. A number of people from Northern Ireland have been detained and questioned by Israeli defence forces whilst visiting Palestine. One example of this is in 2010 Northern Ireland-born Nobel Peace Prize winner Mairead Maguire was deported from Israel and banned from the region for 10 years for attempting to break a naval blockade of Gaza. So I hope that this video has helped explain the reasoning behind the mutual respect and support between the Irish and the Palestinians, and I must admit I do feel such a sense of pride and happiness being an Irish-descended Muslim. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect the Palestinians and make them among the victorious, and reward the Irish with guidance to the faith of Islam. Ameen.